Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Tools and Solutions webinar, which is organized through the Food and Agricultural Commodity Systems Community, formerly known as the Green Commodities Community. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box so we can find out who has joined us. You can type your name, organization, and the location you're joining us from. So today, our expert, Lara Jacob, whom I welcome very warmly, is here with us. Lara is from the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, and she will introduce a global banking training program, which was developed as part of the Good Growth Partnership by the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative in collaboration with the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. Today's session will be an opportunity to explore the perspective of the banking community on issues related to global deforestation and the risk associated with financing agricultural commodity production and trade. Lara will also speak about the risk identification process, as well the mitigation mechanisms, which also include tools such as the nature-based solutions. So before handing over to Lara, I wanted to mention that this session is recorded, and we also have live interpretation to Spanish. Throughout the presentation, feel free to post your questions or comments in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on it. And at the end, we will have some time to address those questions and comments together with Lara. Thank you for joining us. And Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra, for that warm introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. Pardon me, still a bit early for me on the west coast of Canada time here. As Alexandra mentioned, what I'm presenting today is a seminar that is in essence a kind of compressed training that we if you can just go back one slide, that we developed for, thank you, Federica, for the banking community. And it was really aiming to just build capacity for banks in particular, so that they had a capacity and awareness relating to why deforestation risks matter to them. And what they can do to manage and mitigate those risks in their financing practices. So when we delivered the original training to the banks, it was actually done over 6 sessions covering 4 modules, so about 12 to 14 hours in total. And what you are receiving today is a significantly slimmed down version of that training. So it's a sort of highlights reel of what we've presented. And the purpose of the seminar today, if we can move on to the next slide, Federica, is to provide insight into how banks understand risks, how they understand land use risk in particular when financing forest or agricultural commodities, and how they internalize those risks in their financing decision making. So what we hope at the end of this 45 minutes or an hour is that you would come away with a better understanding of what risk looks like to a bank, you know, what those risk archetypes are, in order to be able to foster a more constructive dialogue with the banking community. And the next slide, yes, thank you. We will so as I mentioned, it's a compressed training covering 4 modules in total. The first module basically introduces the topic of deforestation risk in the broader sustainability agenda, why it actually presents a risk to banks. Module 2 and 3 will detail how those risks are identified and interpreted and ultimately managed. And module 4 is a sort of continuation of module 3 in that we elaborate on one of the management tactics, which is investing in nature-based solutions. I mean, there are many, but we've decided to focus our efforts on NBS. Next slide, please. So we can skip over that one. Perfect, thank you. So I think this is a slide that many people on this call are familiar with. It comes from the World Economic Forum report, and it highlights that biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse rank as mid to high global risks for the 5 years. And there's a sort of year-on-year increase with that risk. So we also see that environmental risks such as biodiversity and climate action failure are interconnected and actually influence one another. So this becomes even more of a risk when we talk about things like deforestation, because it's a critical issue for both of these environmental risks. And obviously it's going to impact businesses that that depend on those ecosystem services, and conversely, it makes the impact coming out of those business activities even more acute. So next slide, please. This slide talks about the sort of dependency on nature by industry. I believe it's coming out of a PricewaterhouseCoopers report. Again, we sort of see the categorization of risk based on the different types of sectors. And again, forestry, agriculture, fishery, agriculture, and aquaculture come out as top risks, top sectors that have a high dependency on nature, both from a direct operation perspective as well as the supply chain perspective. And so what we can glean from this is that, losing nature or having the loss of natural capital is going to incur significant financial losses for those businesses that depend on natural capital. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we talk a lot about natural capital risks when we engage with the finance sector, because it's a term that resonates with them quite a bit more so than ecosystem degradation in a lot of ways, or biodiversity, which is something that is quite nascent for a lot of banks. So we sort of see here that this diagram illustrates how banks are exposed to natural capital risks through the clients in which they lend to. So for example here, if we kind of go through what this sort of means ultimately for a bank and how it impacts them in their loan books. So for example, if a farm in an area of high deforestation suffers from increased soil erosion, flooding, and nutrient runoff after, let's say, a massive event like rainfall, it can lead to reduced yield for the agricultural producer. This reduced yield may impact the farmer because he's got reduced profit now. This can lead to difficulties with servicing loan repayments. And what happens is that a bank can experience non-performing loans in the end. Next slide, please. So conversely, natural capital risks may also present an opportunity for a bank, but it should be noted that, you know, the option or the opportunity to sort of translate risk into a kind of financial opportunity where they experience a kind of net positive benefit is not always possible. But, you know, in some instances we can do this through various mitigation measures. So for example, a bank can finance nature positive actions around the farm location. This can include things like replanting trees, which can increase soil stability and reduce erosion. This will help ensure maintenance of the ecosystem services that provides for the farm. This can help increase the yield for the farmer, resulting in profit and the ability to service their own loan repayment. So as a bank, this essentially translates to a well-performing loan and a well-performing client, strictly from the financial sense here. Next slide, please. So here we see an example coming from the palm oil sector. And we asked when we did the training, can you spot where the deforestation risks lie within the supply chain of a client? And, you know, the key message here is that risks for banks can actually arise at all aspects of the commodity supply chain. And it's actually very context specific, it's very geographic specific. And it really depends on where those clients are located and how they're financing them. So what we can derive from this diagram is just the sheer complexity of those business relationships that a bank essentially needs to keep track of when they're financing clients. And obviously, while deforestation is most associated with the production stage, risks can affect all downstream stages and actors. So we try to really hammer in the point that risk is complex, and you need to be very much aware of your supply chain, and geography is paramount. Next slide, please. So, you know, why does this matter to banks other than non-performing loans? And we can actually, because I just realized the link is, you know, moving, it's a live link. So maybe Federica can play the, yes, please. Yeah, if you can play the, thank you. Your sound.
Did you know that on average, 7 million hectares of tropical forests disappear every year? The equivalent of 26 football fields every minute. Most of it comes from agriculture, whether from efficient, large farming businesses or low-yield smallholder farmers. But in order to feed our rising population, farmers need to produce more, and their most cost-effective solution is for them to deforest new terrain. However, today, nearly 40% of our land surface is already dedicated to agriculture. If this goes on, we won't tackle the climate crisis or meet the Sustainable Development Goals. It is critical that we transition to deforestation-free agriculture. But there are obstacles. First, Farmers need technical knowledge to increase yields and at the same time preserve existing forests. Communities and businesses need incentives to restore degraded landscapes, and they need the capacity to implement integrated agroforestry systems where crops, cattle, and forest are mixed. Second, the transition also requires considerable funds, which farmers need to borrow from someone. But lenders and investors face costs and financial risks when financing the transition to sustainable farming. There is a need for governments, public and private finance institutions to scale up the availability of tools such as credit guarantees and junior or first loss loans. These are forms of insurance in case the borrower cannot reimburse his loan. The lender is covered for part of his losses, lowering the risk of such an investment. Grants are also needed to support smallholder farmers with training, development, and replanting, as well as monitoring the progress of businesses and communities to stop deforestation. By coordinating the appropriate government, financial, and corporate actors, UN Environment and partners can trigger a transformational shift in leveraging public funding to unlock and scale up private finance flowing to saving forests, restoring landscapes, and transitioning to climate-smart agriculture. Let's work together to make this global transformation happen.
Thank you, Federica. Yeah, and I think the need for this coordinated effort is even more acute in regions of high land use or deforestation. So for example, here on the slide, we see in Southeast Asia, bank lending represents 66% of financing to forest risk commodities. And in Latin America, this is sort of, we see a similar trend with regards to the importance of agriculture to the economy. Next slide, please. So I think what we, how banks look at risk is sort of in a number of ways. And they're, they essentially glean risk from some of the most pressing trends that we see coming out of the economy or society. I would say first and foremost, the biggest impact on how a bank assesses and responds to its risk is the regulatory trends. This is something that we often hear is that, commitments are great, but unless I'm being forced to do it because of a law or an impending regulation, it's not a really clear business case for me. But we're beginning to see more and more movement in the regulatory sense that integrates deforestation risk consideration. So for example, the new EU policy on deforestation, trade deals such as the EU-Mercosur agreement, due diligence requirements. This really puts the spotlight on forests with greater requirements by importing countries and policy implementation in the producing countries. Next slide, please. Another important trend that we see are market trends to ethical supply chains or sustainable supply chains. So while the consumption of forest risk commodities will continue to increase, we're beginning to see more and more commitments by consumers and by different jurisdictions and companies or groups of companies making the commitment to only purchase sustainable or deforestation-free or source deforestation-free commodities. Next slide. Then we have societal trends, and I think this kind of falls under the auspices of reputational risk for banks. And I would say it's sort of been long the impetus for action by the financial community at large. And this often comes in the form of, bad press or bad media coverage or NGO campaigns, many of which are, we see here. And so this sort of has led to a call for greater transparency by civil society as a whole, and financial institutions needing to respond to that need for greater transparency. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have the banks themselves, I think, starting to internalize these trends and address stakeholder concern. And these changes have happened in a number of ways. One is the banking community coming together. So for example, in the Principles for Responsible Banking, this is a framework that was developed by UNEP-FI, and it essentially helps signatory banks start to align their portfolios, pardon me, start to align their portfolios with the Paris Climate Agreement and with the SDGs. And they're working now on quite concrete actions around biodiversity, target setting. And then we've got, the business or the real economy also coming together through initiatives like the Soft Commodities Impact. But obviously FIs are involved in that through the Banking Environment Initiative, and then various collective actions and initiatives. Next slide, please. So this slide demonstrates a kind of framework for how financial institutions look at risk, and where those risks can lie throughout the value chain of a transaction. I would say reputational risk is still quite paramount for banks. The legal and regulatory is something that is obviously very compliance driven and site specific. So a bank will look to its subsidiaries or its clients to see, where they're operating in the event that there is a legal breach happening, because you definitely do not want that either bad press or fines incurred. And then obviously you've got markets, market risk or transition risk, sometimes we call it, or operational risk. We've sort of addressed that as well. So we will sort of do a kind of a semi-deep dive into the key types of risk archetypes over the next few slides. Next slide, please, Federica. This slide, this just sort of illustrates examples of different types of risks and how they're experienced by financial entities. And I think just sort of in the interest of time, because we're almost more than halfway in the seminar, I'd like to just skip over it and you can read it at your leisure. Next slide. I would say the other aspect of what is happening is all of these risks are now being translated into commitments by financial institutions and by their clients, and they're drawing upon a range of concepts when they're developing their strategies, when they're developing their policies. And so, the question is, how do you implement zero deforestation or zero net deforestation when you're financing a client? And, how do you identify high conservation value or high carbon stock areas for the suppliers of those clients? So this just sort of shows the very complex nature of commitments. And next slide, please. And next slide. I think we can, yeah, complex nature. Yeah, I think we can skip over those. Yes, perfect. Thank you. And those commitments ultimately will then translate into a policy or a strategy for a bank when they need to kind of think of, how am I responding to legal risk? How am I responding to reputational risk or financial risk? And oftentimes the starting point is an internal analysis by a bank. And these are gleaned from know your client questionnaires, onboarding questionnaires, when the ESG or business development teams go out and develop those initial business relationships. So yeah, I mean, these are, this sort of shows a sort of starting point in how a bank will start to kind of address deforestation risks. And the example here is from Société Générale, which implements in their questionnaire as a best practice or standard, asking new clients or potential clients to report on a range of issues relating to deforestation policies and legal compliance, particularly with respect to national law where they're domiciled. Next slide, please. So it's really critical, again, kind of coming back to this idea that legality and compliance is really important for banks, and just needing to be aware of applicable laws associated with their clients. The next slide. Then we come to the financial lens, which is really a culmination of the legal and the regulatory. And it sort of affects, what we're saying here is that financial lens will affect portfolio companies' revenue and profitability. And it can have a financial implication. So next slide, please. Sorry for the background noise. It's very noisy neighbors this morning. So many factors kind of feed into the financial lens. And I would say out of all three risks, the financial one is really the most important for a bank, but it's also the one that is the hardest to develop a business case for, because of the difficulty in kind of connecting and quantifying deforestation risks in sort of actual terms like revenue loss. But you know, these impacts can include revenue loss or a loss of market access, loss of asset value. We talk a lot about stranded assets, the increased of cost of capital. You know, this is more, it's straightforward for upstream companies, but it's sort of less so for, I would say, the mid or downstream clients of banks. Next slide, please. So for banks to start kind of quantifying their risk and their risk exposure to clients and to particular sectors, they rely more and more, I would say, on NGO tools. We have this example from Spot. And these examples give a sort of idea of how NGO tools can apply values to different risks. And it allows financial institutions to then compare companies before investing in them. And so these scores can then be used to create a deforestation risk adjusted return for a bank. Next slide, please. So the scorecard format is also something that banks use, and it brings together a kind of multitude of risk, and it allows for the application of weighting for each type of risk. Again, it allows a company to a bank to kind of compare between companies in order to benchmark them. So the scorecard is a relatively low-cost option for a bank to employ, but it still requires a lot of internal capacity to sort of graduate to this level of analysis. Next slide, please. So now we sort of come to this area of this section of how do you, you've identified your risk, you've assessed your risk. How do you respond to it as a bank? And I mentioned internal. Next slide, please. Internal capacity. One of the key things we also touched on in the last few slides was, setting up deforestation risk policy or strategy. For many banks, a policy is not really necessary. I mean, once they've done their portfolio screening and they see that they have relatively low exposure, they don't anticipate that they're going to be financing forest risk commodities in any kind of volume in the future, a policy might not be the best course of action or necessary for them, because it's going to take a lot of resources and capacity to be able to monitor and effectively implement. So sometimes we say, well, maybe a statement or a commitment, depending on your exposure and your business strategy, is sufficient. And then secondly, building internal capacity to be able to address your strategy, whatever it may be, is really critical. And then, of course, you need the effective implementation with clear roles and responsibilities delineated. So this sort of shows the overall, the kind of risk governance structure or key steps that are necessary in order to address the management of deforestation risk at a bank. Next slide, please. So here we see, how do you set up a strategy? These are elements to consider by a bank. And I've mentioned some of them already. The scope of the policy, the ENS performance requirements, what is sort of the coverage, are you covering the entire value chain of that sector from producer to retailer? Who is going to monitor it, who's going to implement it? And then, we get to the criteria, which are really critical, but they need to be implementable as well by financial entities. So oftentimes banks spend a lot of time looking at the environmental and social performance requirements when setting up a strategy. Next slide, please. Next, we have the need to build internal capacity. This is also no small feat. Oftentimes at banks, particularly national banks, there's one person who is responsible for sustainability, for monitoring, for communications, for marketing. So, what we say here and what we try to promote with the banks that we work with through UNEP Finance Initiative is that this is, for the lack of a better phrase, a group effort. That different people, if you want to do this risk management approach properly, sustainability teams actually should cut across different business lines and different teams within financial institutions, and they need to take and internalize that responsibility. So communications and HR has a role to play, as do your senior leadership, with respect to the maintenance of the governance and the overall advocacy for issues like deforestation risk. So, what that means for NGOs when they, NGOs or any other stakeholder when they engage with banks is, I guess hammering in the important point that this should be a collective effort, and it should be internalized as such. So, here I've highlighted Shift Beyond Sustainability Team because, topic like deforestation risk will die a very slow, painful death if it only is within a sustainability team. Next slide, please. This goes through a typical model of what we have when we engage with leading banks who are quite advanced with respect to their response to not only deforestation, but any other kind of extra financial risk. And we say it's really about setting up a kind of 3 lines of defense and allocating those responsibilities with respect to how those risks are addressed. So next slide, please. How now we sort of come to this, we sort of talked about the kind of risk archetypes, but at the end of the day, there's only sort of so many options available for financial institutions in terms of how it can manage and respond to deforestation risk. And those 3 are: you can monitor, you can avoid, or you can reduce your risk. And all of these 3 types of responses come out of your strategy. And, so things like, what your risk appetite is, the risk severity, your obligations and expectations for that sector, the business context, and results from your initial risk identification and assessment. So this is all part of a kind of strategic response for a bank, rather than a kind of ad hoc approach that you apply to an individual client. Next slide, please. So monitor, it's the lightest touch. It's something where we say, your risk appetite, within the sort of risk appetite that you have currently, the risk is unlikely to become more severe. And you're not really exposed to, let's say, to too many risks already. And what you're doing is just sort of simply monitoring the performance over time, because doing any more is just going to be too cumbersome, and you can't justify the great costs associated with the existing client compliance screening. Next slide. Then we have avoid, where we say, well, you want to avoid or remove the risks from your portfolio, because we say deforestation risks are simply not tolerated at all. So there's sort of 2 things you can do: is make the risk less likely, or avoiding it entirely. Next slide. And to avoid, you could do 3 things. You can include eligibility criteria when you're financing a client. So this is sort of where a lot of the research and engagement with stakeholders is really important to develop those criterias around eligibility for finance. So like, it has to be high carbon stock, you can't finance high carbon stock areas or high conservation value areas, or clients that are operating on protected habitats. Then you've got blacklisting, which is essentially no-go entirely. And we've seen examples, not necessarily from the banking environment, but from asset managers essentially dumping their equity shares in palm oil, the palm oil sector in particular, only to reinvest later on. But blacklisting is something that is feasible or viable option. I would say more for investors than it is for banks who don't want to lose their clients. And then, sorry, I'm talking about divesting. Blacklisting is it's a no-go entirely. So one example of blacklisting that's sort of long been held by banks and asset managers is controversial weapons. And so that is something that is institutionalized within the lending policies of financial institutions, where they say, we will simply not lend to these types of sectors or to these types of clients. And divesting is, after the fact, you've already invested, but you want to sort of remove these types of sectors or clients entirely. And that can come out of, various reasons. Next slide. And then you finally come to the last type of action you can take as a bank, and that's reducing. So it's like minimizing, mitigating, and we will sort of go through very briefly what those entail. So client engagement, next slide, please. Here we have like the three types that are possible. Client engagement, and that is really an ongoing process. We really, it's, I would say, the one that banks take the most often, because existing channels exist to help support the ongoing process of client engagement with the bank. So it starts from business development right up until your annual review process with a client. And oftentimes what we're seeing is more and more collaborative engagement with financial institutions, and in particular, not only NGOs, but technical capacity partners to help the engagement process, because sometimes a bank just needs that extra bit of information to make the business case more robust for their clients. Then we've got contract and financial response, so changing in tenor or the terms, or foregoing the grace period, change in interest rates. I would say these are the most difficult for the bank to deploy for the client. But it is something that more and more banks are starting to examine. And then thirdly, we've got opportunities. So investing in innovations, or taking a kind of direct interest or direct interest with the client. Next slide, please. So exploring opportunities, we're going to go through just a couple of slides here. So this is really about unlocking potential value for the bank. When we talk about opportunity, it's really about the financial opportunity for the bank, not the opportunity that is, I would say, sort of like the market opportunity that exists, because sometimes I feel we conflate the two. Like, for example, when we talk about the gap in financing for nature-based solutions or for biodiversity, this gap in financing is not necessarily an opportunity for the bank, because it's not something they can unlock the value of. Next slide, please. I think we can skip over that one just for the interest of time. Yeah, so opportunities exist So for example, green bonds is something that more and more banks are starting to look at, and they really have become dominant in the green finance market since 2012. They are essentially debt securities issued to raise capital specifically to support climate-related or environmental projects. So these are various types of green bonds on your slide on the table to your left, like hybrid bonds or KPI or these are sustainability linked bonds. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here we've got a specific example around, sort of structuring deals via capital markets. And one of the examples is from the Brazilian beef company, Marfrig. They announced a 500 million transition bond sale to finance a purchase of a cattle farm from the Amazon biome. So the deal was apparently 3 times oversubscribed by a diverse group of global investors. In its publicly available bond framework, Marfrig indicated that their corporate bond proceeds would be used to ensure the traceability of their cattle supply chains in order to mitigate the risk of deforestation. And they also highlighted that the proceeds of this bond would mainly be used to source cattle from suppliers respecting the environmental and social criteria. So there's sort of different ways of integrating those considerations in. In the case of Marfrig, it was really focusing on the integration of specific requirements in their bonds. Next slide, please. Yeah, another example comes from the IFC forest bonds, and this was meant to kind of channel funds to private sector projects to create viable alternatives to deforestation. I believe this one kind of followed it followed the RED scheme, offering economic incentives to reduce deforestation and invest in low carbon growth. And the key here was that the issuer does not face project risk, since IFC was the guarantor, so they act as a sort of issuer there. Next slide, please. Finally, we come to nature-based solutions. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes, and thank you, Alexandra, for letting me know the time. So nature-based solutions they may be used to reduce deforestation risk. And earlier this week, we actually concluded the module on nature-based solutions to banks. And what we noticed was that there was a lot of interest in this area, but not a lot of capacity to work with this topic and to start conceptualizing what that actually means for them as financial institutions, and how to start structuring deals with NBS in mind, our nature-based solutions in mind. So it's just to sort of let you know that we are working with financial entities, but I think it's still a long ways away. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we can skip these. Yeah, please skip that. Yeah, and I know my colleague Raquel Costra, I believe last month, provided a seminar on blended finance. So blended finance is also a structuring approach, and it allows a bank to reduce risk. So this is employed when there's a high perceived or real risk and potentially poor return for the bank. And oftentimes it's a combination of private capital and development funding, usually from the government, but sometimes it's also philanthropic institutions that are involved. And for those of you who'd like more information on blended finance, who didn't participate in Raquel's great seminar, we can make those slides are available on the platform. Next slide, please. And external collaboration, I would say this is really the approach that banks employ the most when it comes to reducing their risk. So it's client engagement. Oftentimes, they also are, I would say, more and more deploying other activities like signing up to multi-stakeholder initiatives, speaking with their peers, so that includes other banks. However, unlike investors, peer-to-peer information exchange among banks is very difficult because of the kind of competitive nature and inability to disclose client information. I would say the only examples I see where the sort of peer-to-peer information exchange happens is around syndicated deals. And then we've got other types of engagements going on, which are with regulators in particular. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we've gone through these already. Yeah, I would say, multi-stakeholder initiatives are becoming more and more critical for financial institutions because they kind of act as a kind of proxy for legal compliance as well. So, oftentimes the RSPO or the RTRS includes provisions for its members to abide by local law. So for a bank looking to, financing a client, the RSPO or RTRS compliance is really critical for them. And they're starting to engage more and more in these types of initiatives as well to kind of help shape what those next principles within these initiatives should entail. And I think we've covered nature-based solutions already. I think we're sort of getting near to the end of time, are we not, Alexandra?
Yes, we have a couple of minutes left. I haven't seen any questions in the chat box, but I do invite you we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions. So if anyone at the stage has a question to Lara, please feel free either to post it in the chat box or just please unmute yourself and ask it directly.
Hi, Lara. This is Lindsay Larson. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was useful to see the type of engagement work that you've been doing with banks. I was curious, when you're engaging with banks on these topics, what is your appraisal of their actual status in terms of awareness about the issue, response to the issue, internal capacities or systems that they might have in place? And then also, is there a particular aspect of the modules where you see them getting really excited? Like, what is it that they're latching on to?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for that, Lindsay. Yeah, so I would say the capacity and the response varies. So what we did when we delivered the training was we actually developed and delivered specific national training programs to be able to tackle the issues relevant for national financial institutions. And we also deliver training for the sort of more global large banks that are invested kind of everywhere with multiple subsidiaries. And what we've noticed was that among financial institutions domiciled nationally, and I'm painting a picture with very, very large brush strokes here, is that the capacity tends to be quite low. Whereas the banks, the sort of usual suspects like, the HSBCs and the Credit Suisse and the Rabobanks, the capacity is very high, but where they struggle is in sort of the implementation around, the opportunities, how to kind of mainstream some of these risk aspects to their subsidiaries or local counterparts. But I would say there is that kind of divide. And generally, where they latch onto was, for us, the greatest interest in Module 2 around risk identification, risk assessment. And so I had to kind of compress it to 3 slides, but when we delivered it, it was 6 hours. And we kind of went through a lot of detailed work of, hypothetical case studies of, okay, you've got Global Forest Watch. How do you use Global Forest Watch to develop a kind of map of, where your risks lie when you're investing in a particular sector or client? How do you use scorecards? How do you develop them? And so it's quite comprehensive, but I would say it's like the practical aspects, the really nitty-gritty, is what resonated with everyone the most. And the kind of conceptual frameworks were sort of less, they landed a lot less. And I would say it's because financial institutions are getting bombarded with these topics left, right, and center all the time. And I think there's, even if you're not doing very much, there is generally a high level of awareness around land use risk and deforestation.
Great, thanks.
I hope that answers your question.
It does, yeah, it does. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, sure.
So because we're on time, we're not going to be able to take more questions, but we're noting the 2 questions that we have in the chat box, and Amanda and Philippe, we will send you the responses. So thank you everyone for joining us. We will send the materials from that webinar, the PowerPoint presentation and the links to the videos in an email. We will also post those materials on our digital platform, so please do visit us regularly there. And I also invite you to next week Tools and Solution webinar called Value Beyond Value Chains, and Fede will post very quickly the link to register there. Thank you for joining us. Wishing you a lovely day, afternoon, evening, and see you next week, I hope.
Thank you, everyone.